Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our review with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
Hello, Marcus. Tell me about your new studio.
Well, no expenses spared. I'm sitting in a brand new, top-of-the-line infrared sauna as we speak, which thankfully is not switched on,
Right.
so I can survive the recording session here. And here I am back home at my dad's place, who seemingly has invested in an infrared sauna, which I didn't even know existed as a thing.
Well, don't let the infrared rays get to your brain. We need all of your brain, Marcus. We need all of your brain.
It's got great sounds, all I care about.
So who are we talking to today?
So today we're talking to Rita McGrath, who's the author of a book called Seeing Around Corner, who's a lot about inflection points and signals and, predicting or, measuring what's coming next for organizations in order to make them more resilient. So it's a really great talk. But before I talk a bit more, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, the book Seeing Around Corners, it really is trying to help organizations understand how they can spot what's happening with great uncertainty. And of course, COVID is indeed a whole lot of uncertainty going on. So I think it's a really relevant book for the time. There are two things. She talks about inflection points, and an inflection point was that the move from CDs to streaming video is indeed an inflection point. And we've had a couple of books and a couple of guests that we've talked to about how do you look forward into the future and separate a weak signal from a strong signal. But those are really big. I think there are also, and we talk about it briefly during the interview, micro inflection points. Because the smaller your organization, if you're a small or a medium-sized enterprise, the big macro things are out there, but it's the small ones that are going to trip you up. So you need to have a forward-looking on the horizon, not just what's happening at the macro level, but also at the micro level. And the other one, it really wasn't so much a seeing around corners or an inflection point as it was understanding the way organizations used to operate and being in a state of denial when she talks about customers no longer being customers, but becoming hostages. And that means that you put somebody into a long-term subscription and you put up all of these barriers and all of this friction that keeps them from changing. And you're not watching what's happening in the competitive landscape because you are of this belief that nobody's ever going to leave you because you've got them all sort of locked in. And then somebody comes around the corner and says, oh, if you just come over here, all of those friction points don't apply. And poof, all of your customers are gone because you weren't treating them like customers anymore. You were treating them like hostages. So I thought those are my two big takeaways. What about you?
Yeah, well, the one I really, so just to lay it right bare here, so the one I really picked up on, and I'm happy I could make a connection here, is the idea of survivor bias, which is basically we're telling the winners stories and say, right, because that's what the winners did, that's what we should be doing. And it's really nice that Rita was acknowledging the fact that survivor's bias is a huge, huge problem, because we tend to think that, because someone else was successful with it, we will be too, without taking the notion of, well, there might be differences between them and us, and often we don't. And it's sort of a connection I bring back to, what Richard Chataway did a couple of episodes ago when he talked about a lot of biases that we naturally all have, both leaders and anywhere else in an organization. So I was really happy that as much as companies can de-risk by measuring new things, looking at new things, as you said, getting closer to reality, that we have to acknowledge to some extent that we have something as survivor bias still being there and influencing us in those decisions. So I was really happy to hear that too.
Really, really good. So before we go off on another tangent and talk about more infrared rays or anything else, shall we go to the interview?
Yeah, let's do that. So, hello everyone. Today we have Rita McGrath with us. So, hello Rita, and thank you so much for making time for us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Lovely. So, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what made you write the book.
I'm a longtime professor at Columbia Business School, and the book is my fifth book, actually, and it follows on my long-standing interest in strategies really in uncertain environments. And that began with strategies for innovation. And as we continue to see the levels of uncertainty that ordinary organizations have to deal with increase, I've come to realize that a lot of the tools we use for innovation are actually more broadly applicable to strategy in general. And so this particular book was prompted by actually revisiting Andy Grove's idea of strategic inflection points and how you can anticipate them, how you can decide what to do about them, and then how you bring the organization with you, which is often the most difficult thing.
Yeah, bringing the organization along. I mean, we've been doing these podcasts for a while. This is about our 14th episode that we've been doing. And that is indeed a common theme, that strategy is great, but it's the human side of things. It's how do you bring the entire organization along with you when there are so many other competing interests and or kind of competing personalities in the mix. And I really like that part of the book.
Thank you. I think one of the other things is that when you're making decisions about the future, reasonable people can disagree about what that future holds.
Absolutely, and I think there's this whole area of like futurists and whatnot, and what kind of things and trends to pick up on. Obviously, we always have the media and the kind of stories that now through the internet we have even more of that a lot of companies are picking up on. And the tricky part's always about what's the evidence behind it, and what's the real thing and what's just a hype. So, and you give some really great examples of large enterprises and how they either did or did not spot and respond to particular inflection points in that. And many of the inflection points discussed were very macro, like let's say, for example, the shift to streaming video. Could you discuss a little bit how small and medium enterprises or even startups can adjust, like detect and adjust for these kind of inflection points that you talk in your book, please?
Well, I think the small and medium enterprises have some advantages over the larger ones in that the ship isn't as big that they have to move. So if they can be quick about it, they can often carve out a very interesting set of opportunities that a larger company might take more time to get to. So a great example of that here in the US is a company, I think they're based in Pennsylvania, called Timberlane, and their main business was making beautiful designer shutters for houses. And with the pandemic, that business pretty much dried up. People weren't, well, maybe they are now, but in the early stages, people weren't so much interested in remodeling their homes as in figuring out, what this new reality was. And their CEO was terrified of having to fire his people and shut down operations. And of course, nobody knows how long this is going to last. And so he basically pivoted their production to manufacturing personal protective equipment. And he's actually grown his company in the pandemic. So it's been a really nice story of that.
Yeah, that's really good when somebody can actually see what's happening and realize what resources they have available, and then make that kind of a shift. Like you say, from moving from making shutters for windows to actually making PPE equipment. That's
Hmm.
and do it fast.
Hmm. Well, and I think what's also interesting about SMEs is you'll often find that they have a much more connected relationship with their people on the ground than a large enterprise does. So unfortunately, with big companies, there can often be these incredible disconnects that emerge between where the strategy decisions get made and what's happening on the front lines. You can see this sort of massive kind of, well, that was stupid, what is headquarters thinking kind of modality kick in.
Mm.
Whereas a small enterprise has a much closer relationship often to what I call the edges of the organization, where things are actually happening.
Um, the other question that we were trying to get to, I think, with this as well, is a big macro change, like the move from CDs to streaming video, is a large inflection point. In small and medium sized enterprises, do you think that there are indeed smaller inflections that are happening that will have a bigger impact because they're a smaller organization?
Well, certainly for any company who depends on people feeling comfortable in the company of strangers, that's going to ricochet around their business model forever. And you can either assure your customers that it's safe, or you can kind of remain in, you know, frozen animation until some kind of cure or vaccine or treatment is available. So clearly, a smaller company is going to be a lot more vulnerable to that kind of thing. Um, Smaller companies are first of all, they're the bulk of the economy, and secondly, they tend to occupy these local niches, so they're more affected, I think, by purely local phenomena than something major like the transition from CDs to streaming. So, as an example, just the wage and employment controls in your particular part of the world will have an impact on what you can do in terms of your freedom to act, what your responsibilities are to your employees, and so forth.
Right. And on a micro level, then, if they are indeed local, and that's another one of my favorite things to talk about, is this shift that I think is happening from globalization to kind of hyper localism. Is it possible that you could even see a minor inflection point that would have a big impact from a city council making a change in an ordinance, or something else happening with a new manufacturing plant coming in, and it changes the dynamics? And I think what we're trying to figure out is, where do you look for small inflection points that'll have a big impact, and not just the big ones that are happening, like 5G and Internet of Things and those kinds of things.
Well, I think any local, any business that operates with local resources and sells to local people is going to be subject to these micro level inflection points. And so, if you just take towns and cities, right, one of the things that's happening in the US, and I suspect happening in other places, is a lot of talented people are going back to smaller cities, and they're saying, we can work remotely, we can work from anywhere. So why would we be subject to the high rents and the penalties of living in a large city when you can have a very good quality of life and a decent paying job in a smaller city? So that would be an example of an inflection point that could make a difference. Now, that much being said, so let's say somebody waves a magic wand and the disease gets kept at bay by the end of the first quarter of 2021. Will that shift stick? And that's what we've got to really consider, because I think some of it will. Some people will discover, yes, it's a more efficient way of working and I don't have to commute and so forth and so forth. But I think what they'll also discover is that larger employers will tend to adjust their salaries for the living cost where they are. And it'll be on the smaller employers to say, hey, we can build an ecosystem here that remains viable once people have a choice of where they want to operate.
Yeah, I wrote an article recently that said that we need to really rethink how we're doing salaries from cost plus to value. So it shouldn't matter where I live. It should matter what I bring to the organization, what I bring to the business, and my remuneration should be aligned with that.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a whole lot of people that are saying, well, you're right, I don't have to live in London anymore, but I still want the London salary. I'm
Hmm.
like, okay, well, that's still kind of cost plus. The question is, how much are you actually positively impacting and delivering value to the business? And then we can talk about where you do or do not have to live.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you think about the system at Netflix, they have always done that. They give their people enormous amounts of freedom. They pay them at the top of the market, and they evaluate that regularly. So if somebody's grown three times in their capability in the course of a year, they could get a three times raise in salary. They don't pay bonuses. Where you do business is up to you. How you do business is up to you. There's a tremendous amount of freedom, but in exchange, um, you'll have to take a lot of responsibility. But they've just completely done away with this cost plus idea.
I think it's great, like, and especially talking about more that kind of value and outcome based approach to things, and therefore, so let me ask you a bit more about, yet again, sort of customer focus, because there's a lot of companies who claim customer focus. There's few companies who execute and execute it well, but it's been become evident that there's a lot of value in being very customer focused. So when you talk about picking up on particular signals and inflection points that are particularly based around customer values, customer behaviors, and new opportunities for businesses. Um, what's your thoughts on the shift that some organizations have to go through from a very classic approach to the way they've been measuring and looking at things and observing things to a new way that is way more customer centric? Potentially even, when you talk about defining your air arena, that they might have to redefine the arena in order to look at what the next value will be, or the new value will be post COVID, and then having to measure differently. So what's your view on that, to be able to measure into a new map, basically? The old map's gone, the new map's been appearing. How do you shift that as an organization? How can you tell which things to measure, which not, and what sort of the new sensors you should be applying, so to speak?
Well, I think the big solution that people need to be working on is driving their business from leading indicators rather than lagging indicators. And if you want to become whatever, more customer centric, faster, more agile, whatever the thing is that you want to move toward, if you're still measuring people on past behavior, well, you're not going to get the kind of new behavior that you're looking for. So, a great example of this is Microsoft, which compensates its senior people on the basis of two kinds of metrics. So, the first metric is what they call performance metrics, and those are traditional, sales, revenue, blah, 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 growth over year. But the other half of their compensation comes from what they call power metrics. And in a business where increasingly customer usage, they're increasingly in subscription businesses across all kinds of platforms. And so customer usage becomes a super important matter. And what Satya Nadella will say, he's the CEO, he would say, before you use our products, you have to love our products. So we want to measure customer love. I mean, think about that, Microsoft. But I think the philosophy there is very true. So, if you're measuring actions that directly relate to customer focus and customer satisfaction, and you're rewarding for that, then you're going to get a lot more of that behavior than if you're measuring on more traditional metrics.
So if businesses, so I've come across a lot in especially working on change and transformation projects where you went from efficiency around just fixing the old thing, and then effectiveness, which means you can look at different areas that you can prove new values in, which sets a bigger freedom to that. If you look at that, it seems that often there's a difference between quantitative and qualitative ways to measure things. Do you have a view on really expanding that? Because you can measure customer value or customer benefits, customer value in a lot of things, from increased sales, which are very straightforward numbers, to maybe other aspects that go quite into the emotional and qualitative aspect. Do you have a view on that, sort of how far out we can these days maybe measure and kind of go out with? Is that something you've been observing? You have some examples on?
Well, there's a lot more data out there, I think, and in the old days, I think just being able to pull together the data gave you a lot of power and a lot of influence. Today, I think what's scarce is meaning. What do those data mean, and to whom, and for how? So I think the big qualitative challenge now is, how do you tell the story around your data so that you can persuade other people, that you can bring the organization along, so that you can do things. So I think part of the skill of leadership is telling, interpreting the information, not just providing it.
That's really interesting, because I think there's so one thing I'm quite interested in, and I've seen this happening quite a bit, is that traditionally you have a leadership level strategy team or strategy ambition that sort of very top line defines of where we want to go, what we want to do, what we think the problem is. And more growingly, you have quite further down into basically the design and delivery teams. You have human-centered research, customer-centric research in sort of design thinking and service design that are starting to gather really valuable data in terms of insights and customer realities that often doesn't get fed back to the leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So if we talk about things like leadership and receiving disconfirming information. What are your views on how we might close that gap, or how we, is it a gap, is it a cycle? How do you see that when you say leadership maybe sets the direction, but then a lot of teams on the ground are actually bringing a lot of data back, and that information doesn't always flow back,
hmm
and they're not always enabled. So what's your view on how this should work
Well,
in
I
a
had a really
perfect
interesting
sort of
exchange, in fact,
scenario?
just this morning with, a large company, and they're doing work about the future, and they're defining all these major trends, and they're describing the way that they're looking at these trends, as part of their research project. And I said to them, you've really got to stop a moment. These trends are all very significant to you. They're how you're looking at the problem statements and you're looking at the threats and opportunities in your environment. They have absolutely nothing to do with your external stakeholders, your customers, your suppliers, your people in your value chain. If you really want to understand the future, yes, these trends are very important to you, but they're an outcome of some other process that you haven't laid out here. So, for example, price pressure. They happen to be in a very heavily regulated environment, and there's a lot of price pressure. I said, yeah, but you need to understand where the price pressure is coming from, what kind of impact it's likely to have, and is it possible for you to deliver the value to customers at the price that they're prepared to pay? Have you asked those questions? And they hadn't even done that. So I think it's very, very easy, to sort of get trapped in this world of your own creation where the way that you're even defining the problems are internally referential. And I think that's the biggest information gap I see, where I can tell you exactly what the problems are with my business from the perspective of why I, would be happy or not happy about changes in the environment. But until you get outside yourself and really look at what's going on, outside the boundaries of your organization, you're not going to get to any kind of truth.
Yeah, I mean, we've been hearing that in quite a couple of conversations we've had. The whole idea of like, how do you get closer to reality? How do you actually get close to reality? And I've been working through a lot of different, industries that all seem to be claiming to know that they know what's going on, but actually because they're working with 10-year-old data, which has obviously changed in the last 20 years at least, if not even further. But talking about the signals or the value, the insights that are coming back from the customer level, then you still obviously have the business benefits to consider, and there must be a balance must be struck. So when you look at that in terms of the signals that are coming in, how do you tend to balance the customer benefit and the business benefit in order to have a business that can grow? Because if there's only customer, the business is not going to make money. If there's only business, customer doesn't have any value, and no one's going to come and buy your stuff. How do you struck sort of the middle ground on that when you talk about these things?
Well, you really need to understand what value you're creating for your customer, and then your pricing strategy should be designed accordingly, and then your operations have to be designed to support that. So let's take a specific example that might make it more clear. So imagine going to a grocery store, and I'm going to ask you a very simple question, which is, tell me how much a carrot costs. And you're going to accept that challenge and go to a grocery store. And what you will find, if you are diligent about your trip through that grocery store, is you will find there's probably 15 different prices for carrots. So there's a price for the artisanal carrots that still have the leaves on them, that were hand picked by a little old lady in Delaware and, personally delivered to the store on a burrito or something. Um, then there'll be a price for the little bag of carrots that you put in your children's lunch boxes, right? And they're all in their little individual bags so that they stay clean. Then there's going to be a price for the giant 5-pound bag of carrots that people buy to make carrot juice out of. Then there's going to be a price for the sort of conventional carrots you might buy to put soup in. Then there's, we'd already been talking about canned carrots, frozen carrots, da 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 da. So my point is that there is no one price for carrots for one particular customer. If you're in that store, say it's a fancy upscale organic store, you may be willing to pay $5 for this beautiful bag of artisanal miniature carrots with the leaves still on them, because you're going to use it to make a statement, about perhaps a party that you're having. And that's a completely different value proposition for the same basic molecules as the guy that wants 5 pounds of it to make juice. So I think, you need to really understand what that end customer is valuing, and what they're valuing is not the molecules in the carrot, it's something else. It's about the consumption and usage experience of the carrot.
So that was a really, really good example, and it's very concrete. And you mentioned that you're a professor as well.
Mhm.
What kind of lessons are you trying to use, or do you use that kind of example in the classroom? And what are you getting back from the students? How are you trying to help the students who attend and proceed through your class to be better when they get into those enterprises? And how do you use some of those same examples when you're in an enterprise doing some consulting, saying, look, you need to change. I'm going to do the same thing I do in my class. Do you have any really good examples like that? Because what our audience wants is they want actionable things that they can do today to try to improve the way they're doing things. So since you're a teacher and a consultant, what's one of your big things? This is one of the things I almost always do.
Well, I almost always try to give them that kind of example and then encourage them to take those frameworks and apply them to other settings. So let me give another example. If you think about any customer or any stakeholder that you're trying to understand, they're always caught in sets of experiences, which I call a consumption chain. So, without somebody being aware they need something, there is no consumption that's going to happen. So, the first point of departure really has to be, how do people become aware that they have a need? Once they're aware, how do they search for solutions? Once they're happy with the solution that they found, do they take the next step and actually become a buyer or a consumer? Once they've done that, what's the payment experience like, right? And then what's the actual receipt or delivery of the good like? So you can build this very systematic step by step picture of the customer's journey through this consumption chain. And what I try to get my participants to realize is that just because somebody might be in the market for something you might be able to sell them, it doesn't mean they're going to complete the purchase, right? I mean, the most vivid competitor any of us will ever have is non-consumption. We just decide to do nothing, right? Or we hit some kind of roadblock and the chain comes to a screeching halt. And even worse, the senior leadership may have absolutely no idea of what's actually going on as part of the customer experience. So let me give another example. I had a box of books I wanted to send overnight via FedEx. So I call up the FedEx guy and arrange for a pickup. And I have a typed sheet of paper with all the information that you would put, to get the thing delivered to where it needs to go and who's going to get charged and what's the credit card. Everything's there, right? All the information. So he comes to the door and looks at my box, which I'm about to hand him, and he looks absolutely horrified. And I said, what's wrong? And he says, well, this box doesn't have a label on it. And I said, well, okay, go get me a label from your truck and I'll happily fill it out for you if that's what's necessary. And he looks at me as though I'm crazy. And he says, well, I don't carry labels on my truck. Now, at this moment, I'm thinking to myself, I am the only person on the face of this earth who has ever tried to ship a package by FedEx without filling out a label in advance. And it's not his fault, right? He's caught in this system. So I said to him, well, okay, how would I go about getting a label? And he very helpfully says to me, oh, well, we could overnight you one. And I'm thinking to myself, really? So they're going to send a guy to my house, which is super expensive, right? Then they're going to send another guy to my house with a label, which is also super expensive. Then I'm going to fill out the label and they're going to send a third guy to my house to pick up this box. Now go back to your value versus cost equation. Your cost just went up by an order of 3 to get the same job done that I'm going to pay for once. I mean, that's just crazy. So anyway, he says to me, oh, and I think you can get it on the internet. I think you can do that. And then he left me and my box standing forlornly on my front step. Now, Fred Smith in his corner office in Atlanta, who happens to be the CEO of FedEx, I'm sure this kind of thing does not keep him up at night. But let's just say I really, really, really needed that box to go out that day. I would have put it in the trunk of my car and driven over to UPS, where I wouldn't be confronted with the obstacle of no labels and stuff. The reason I raise it is it's a funny story in a way, but it's also incredibly practical in this application of this tool called a consumption chain. So what I often tell my participants is, don't think about your customer at the act of buying your whatever it is you want to sell them. You really need to be thinking about the entire experience they're having as they're moving through doing business with you. And frankly, for most businesses, nobody gets up in the morning and says, "Woo woo, today, I sign my delivery contract for air conditioners." That's not what I'm buying. I'm buying being cool in the summer, you know. Or back to my carrot example, nobody sort of jumps up and down with excitement. "Oh, I get to pay for carrots at the cash register. This is awesome." No, the carrots mean something else to us. And I think that's where you need to really think about getting outside your own purview and looking at what is really going on with the customer's desired outcome.
Yeah. So that moves me on nicely to the next question that we kind of had lined up. We sometimes have questions, and we sent you questions in advance. You had this concept of customers no longer being customers, and suddenly they're hostages.
Hmm.
And when that happens, does the business recognize that? Can they see around that particular corner to pull the title of the book back in? And I thought that was really an interesting sort of thing. And we were talking what I found cable TV. I
Hmm.
always felt like I was a hostage when it came to cable TV because I had to pay this enormous subscription for 182 channels, four of
Hmm.
which I actually wanted. And I
Yep.
think that really was a hostage mentality. I think that kind of also was, I think it was a driver in why Netflix went forward. Do you think that was also a driver? And can you tell our listeners a bit more about this whole customers versus hostages bit?
Well, customers are hostages when they have no viable choice of how to get that particular job done. And I share your frustration. My husband is a big soccer fan, or football, as I should more appropriately say, and to get the football channels he likes to watch, we have to buy the highest tier of cable there ever existed. And just as an example of, companies being completely tone deaf, right? So we haven't had football, we haven't had live sports, and yet we're still paying the very highest tier for sports coverage. And it wasn't until I called them up and said, hang on, we're not getting sports delivered to us. I don't want to be paying this price. That then they said, "Oh, okay, we'll back down." Now, a customer centric company would have proactively reached out to me and said, "Look, we understand there's no sports, so we're going to bump you to a lower tier until things get back to normal, just to show you how much we care and appreciate about your business." They didn't do that. They're counting on people being too busy or lazy or distracted or whatever, to just keep paying the bills over and over again. So that is really a hostage mentality, and it's created when there realistically are no choices. There's, super high switching costs. If you give up your cable company, very often that's connected to your internet, very often that's connected to your email, and that's going to be, 3 years worth of hassle while you try to recover things that were sent to your old email address, and. So there's all these built-in barriers to you being able to easily switch. Now, the trouble with that from a company point of view is it's not stable. And so, as soon as something shifts in the environment, or there's a regulatory change, or there's some other shift that allows customers to do without you, they will leave you in droves.
Yeah, that is indeed the problem because once somebody comes up with a solution that doesn't have all of those frictions against change, then people will indeed abandon and
Hmm.
move on.
Absolutely.
Um,
Well, the
Marcus,
other
did you
thing
have
is
one more?
also, yeah, no, absolutely. So one I have might be a bigger one, because we just went through a couple of examples, and I think in our experience, a lot of examples, values, decision points, things that start to work better or exponentially better than others, are often very complex, right? They're systemic, so they have systems or exponential properties. How do you, when you look at individual technologies, or rather maybe behaviors and needs, which can be very complex, how can you define and differ between small changes, iterative changes, and bigger steps in order to identify, well, now we have an inflection point, and now we have enough happening that we can consider the next step? Because oftentimes the problems or the challenges at hand, or the needs, or the solutions you try to create are very complex. So sometimes, just having bits and pieces of that improve might not still make a change yet because the threshold's not quite met. How do you normally look at these in terms of, can you give some examples maybe how when a lot of things are changing so much and a lot of problems are so complex, to say, well, what's the priority? What are the bigger pieces we should be looking at? And what are the smaller pieces? Can we identify the bigger and the smaller pieces to identify, well, if that's if that's changing, that's more significant than this part. Did you understand what I'm getting at? I'm trying to explain it a little bit.
Sort of. I would say that
Sorry.
the path of an inflection point is that, in the very early stages, the signals are very weak and nobody really understands what it means, right? So Jim McKelvey, who's a co-founder of Square and wrote a fantastic book called The Innovation Stack, makes this point. He says, when the Wright brothers invented manned flight, it was a completely new thing. Nobody knew what it portended. Nobody understood the vast implications of people being able to reliably get up in the air and do things. And he's a pilot. He said, so today, he said, I'm certified in all these different aircraft and in all these different procedures. But when the Wright brothers invented flight, nobody knew what to make of it. And it takes a long time from that initial breakthrough before you really see the system-wide implications of things. And so, what did manned flight do? It disemboweled the trains. It took out many other applications of transport and shipping. It revolutionized global supply chains, and. But very often, that early stage, there's sort of an unawareness, right? Then people become aware, and then there's this hype stage, right, where everybody's running around going, "Oh my God, this is happening, and it's happening tomorrow, and we have to be first movers," and blah 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 blah. And I would say autonomous vehicles are kind of there right now. Like, what nobody's talking about is the technology is not the problem. The technology for autonomous driving is pretty good, and especially in closed environments, it's excellent. So that's not the issue. The issue is humans. We don't have an ownership regime. We don't have an incentive regime. We don't have a risk regime. Who's going to take responsibility if this thing hits the baby and not the grandmother, or vice versa? Do we really want autonomous vehicles that will drive exactly as the law suggests, right? We don't know about things like, well, if we're human, we can see somebody's trying to parallel park and we'll pause and wait for them to get out of our way. What would an autonomous car do in those things? If you're going from one town to the next, where one town has, I live in New Jersey in the United States, and we have a very unique to New Jersey thing called a dog leg. So if you want to make a left off a road, very often you have to exit to the right and then actually cross over the road to make a left. I've never understood it, but it's one of the few places in the US that has that system. Well,
Yeah.
who's going to explain that to the autonomous vehicle? It thinks you want to go left, it's going to line up in the left-hand lane because that's how most of the world operates. So those are the issues that create an immature ecosystem. And one of the pieces I work on a lot is, how do you know when an ecosystem is mature? And I link this back to that customer consumption chain problem, which is, if I can't get my complete outcome delivered, then I still got an incomplete ecosystem. And whatever I'm doing is not going to take hold until that problem gets solved.
I think this is really interesting. What I really love about that is obviously that you're hitting on a really strong point here that I totally agree with, which is, tech is not the problem. A lot of technologies are commoditized enough, but the human aspect makes it a wicked problem. It makes it this thing that keeps evolving, that is so hyper complex that will take a bit longer to really figure it out enough so that it's ready for market.
Well, you'll see it in
Given
closed.
that,
You'll see it in closed systems, right? So where you can take out
but closed systems are they're like lab environments, right?
Mhm.
That's doesn't define the wicked problem, which the wicked problem keeps evolving and keeps be elusive to you, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So if I look at that, so the one thing I'm asking myself, and I'm asking you in this case, is that oftentimes, and maybe let's not talk about when this point is really happening for it to be solved enough so it gets accepted by consumers. But one thing then is there, when we read a lot of articles of previous successes, is the whole idea of survivor bias,
Mhm.
which means that, the ones that succeed, the ones that actually get there in sort of just about the right way with a lot of luck and a lot of smarts, then we look at them and go like, well, maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's how we should measure. Maybe that's what good enough looks like.
Mhm.
What's your thought on that, to bring that into the discussion? Because that's a tricky part, isn't it? Which exact markers you should look at, to what level? It feels like a very complex thing to look at, and a bias that is Is that sort of, can we sort this out? Can we work around it? Can we be secure about enough
Well, I think
to
when
make a
it
claim on
depends,
things?
well, who you are, right? If you're trying to make a decision today for your
Yeah.
business, that's one problem. If you're trying to really understand how a phenomenon unfolds, that's another. I do think survivor bias is a huge issue, and it's accompanied by what we call the halo effect, which is
Mm-hmm.
you know
Yeah.
making decisions about someone or something because we know what the outcome was and assuming that whatever they did was great. So my colleague Phil Rosenzweig talks a lot about this. He says, uh, if you'd read a business school case study about Percy Barnevik in the 80s, it would have been all, oh, here's Europe's Jack Welch. And the genius of his way of running ABB is this decentralized, empowered organization where, choices get made at a local level. And then, of course, the business tanks. 10 years later, there's all these critiques of Percy Barnevik saying, he lost control of the company. He didn't really provide clear strategic direction. All these fiefdoms went off in their own direction. Same guy, same company, completely different interpretations of what's going on. So I think we fall into that very often. In terms of your question about ecosystems and people that survive ecosystems, if you think about it, many of the companies we hold up today as great successes um, got there. There's a fair amount of luck involved. I mean, Google tried to sell itself in the early stages for $1 million to Yahoo, and Yahoo wasn't interested. And here's Google, one of the most profitable businesses ever to be created on the face of the earth. Netflix begged Blockbuster to buy them, and Netflix wanted to run Blockbuster's online arm, and Blockbuster basically left them out of the house. I mean, and. So I think, there are these twists in the story that dictate whether the outcome is going to go one way or the other. And I think we over index on, oh, that was destined by fate. It wasn't destined by fate. If you ask anybody who's ever lived through one of these things, they'll say there were these incredible turning points where it could have gone either way. And so too, I think with a lot of these business stories, you have many situations where it literally could have gone either way.
I
Yeah.
refer to those
I
in my
think
life
that's.
as sliding door moments.
Mm.
There was a great movie called Sliding Door, and one door closed, another door opened, and a completely different reality could have happened.
Hmm.
And I think I personally really like the beauty of these things being elusive and keep evolving. And so I think, fortunately, I have to look a little bit at a time. But what I really liked about your book is this idea that you really look at all these different points and these different parts and signals and whatnot, and really to understand, or definitely organizations should definitely more focus on that and more evolve these things in order to take, let's say, just a more de-risk view on what the future might hold. Because I think we all know, as we just sort of confirmed, that reality is a bit more complex than, it's a bit weirder than fiction, so to speak.
Mm.
And so essentially, there is no answer. There's luck involved. There's other bits and pieces involved. But at the same time, getting closer to reality, which is one of the themes we've seen in a lot of talks and interviews we had so far, is quite essential. And maybe these days, getting closer to reality is cheaper and easier than ever, even for some of the big ones. I don't know, but
Well, it can
your
be.
thoughts on
It
that?
can be. I mean,
Yeah.
the critical scarce resource today is attention. It's not money, and typically
Yeah.
it's especially in the midst of this pandemic, we're all just overwhelmed with inputs. So, when people ask me how do you judge whether a company is innovative or not, let's say I get that kind of question a lot, and I'll say, tell me what your senior people are spending their time on, and I'll tell you whether they're committed to innovation or not. And if they're the kind of company where people are running from meeting to meeting and their days are completely full, and the soonest you can get a key discussion with the decision maker is 4 weeks out, um, you know, you just, I mean, you don't have, does not require genius to diagnose that they're not gonna see these things until it's too late.
Yeah.
I
One
think that's
comment
the.
on attention. I keep having a number of debates with people about Facebook selling data. I'm like, Facebook doesn't sell data. Facebook sells attention. It's filtered by data, but they're selling your attention. And it's a nuance that I debate a lot with, in the Twitter sphere and other inane places on that particular topic.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's because we're talking about Facebook and Twitter and all these things having such an impact on reality. I think, as you just said, Rita, if the leadership, as probably much as the teams, spent a bit more time on getting closer to reality, paying attention to what is really going on. I think the times we're living now, where the guidebook which is thrown out of the window, you have to redefine a lot of things. Paying attention, probably the most valuable asset we have. And I think it's really lovely in your book that you spend a lot of time looking exactly at that, going like, look at the signals, look at all that. So as usual, we're nearly run out of time. We have so many more questions. It's a great book. Really enjoyed it, Rita. So all I can say for now is thank you for your great insights. Thank you for your time, and thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, and keep in touch.
Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.